I think we are now back on Facebook, and we are recording for YouTube, and we are continuing our discussion with Gary Chartier of Chapter 2, entitled Learning, in his book, The Idea of an Adventist University. So I see Bronwyn has just returned to her place, and I wonder, do you have someone in line to speak, Bronwyn?
I do. First of all, we have Rodney Corker, followed by Peter Chimperu.
Rodney, over to you.
Hi, nice going this morning, Gary. Thank you very much. I've got a triple-layered question. I'll try and get there quickly. The rubric of these questions is really the consistency or fluidity of student demand, consumer demand. Are students over the past decade in last era enrolling for the same reasons they did in the previous decade? Is there a constancy and stability in what students are looking for, or is the purpose of learning really quite fluid or becoming fluid? And is that a product, if so, is that a product of curriculum design or faculty composition or both? And my last question is, in particular, how do you explain the increase in the last 5 years of in-your-face social activism by graduates from many colleges?
Wow. Okay. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to answer all of those questions well. So I think that first of all, we just see over time, seems to me, a lot of just cyclical shifts in student interests. That seems to me to be an important feature of what goes on campus. I also think, however, that there's been a pretty pronounced change in the composition of our student body, and I'm guessing that similar changes, perhaps less pronounced, are evident in other student bodies, other Adventist student bodies. Namely, if I think about what was going on when I was an undergrad, in the mid '80s, and certainly I think the way things would have looked when, a number of other people, let's say, just pick on Dave, when somebody like Dave would have been an undergrad in the mid '60s. And I guess the way I would describe that is that very much in the '60s, and I think still to a great extent in the '80s, students came to Adventist schools because they were Adventist schools, and people who had associations with the church just thought that it was obvious that they should go very often to Adventist schools. Their parents certainly thought that in most cases, and so as a result, the student body consisted largely of a very substantial cross section of people from the Adventist church community, and that meant that people who could have gone anywhere, who could have gone to Stanford, who could have gone to Pomona College, who could have gone to UCLA, found themselves instead going to Adventist schools, and so those students, I think, wanted from Adventist institutions what they would have wanted from the best educational institutions that they might have gone to. I think what's happened is that it's less obvious now to many parents and students that they should be attending, that the students should be attending Adventist institutions. And so Adventist institutions don't have the same luxury that I think they probably had to deliver curricula to students who were there, for a broad range of reasons. The students who've really, I think, often wanted the kind of richest educational experiences are often the ones who can go to many different places, and these days are choosing to go to many different places. And students, at places like La Sierra, that just the demographics have shifted. We're serving a lot of first-time college attendees, and what's the best way to put it? So I think that we have to be aware that immersion in learning is not itself a luxury, but probably majoring in curricula that helps people immerse themselves in learning is going to seem like a luxury to an important subset of students. They don't have family resources necessarily. They're going to make it easy for them to thrive. Whatever they happen to study and whatever they do, they're going to need to make sure that they're employable. Now, I absolutely think there are things you can do with curricula in those kind of traditional liberal arts areas that will indeed render you employable, but it's less obvious what that looks like for a lot of people. And so I think that probably, so to some extent there are cyclical changes in people's interests that are evident in all institutions, but I think in Adventist institutions in particular there are real changes, because not just cultural shifts that affect student attitudes, but also demographic shifts that affect just the nature of the student population and the incentives that students face naturally lead to differences, I think, in student expectations and goals. Lastly, Rodney, you ask about a certain kind of activism on campuses. I mean, we certainly have observed intense student activism. Again, I think on a cyclical basis. In the 60s, we saw that. We again saw a lot of it in the early 90s. And so probably there's a sense in which this is kind of an every 30 years or so phenomenon. Again, I think not an unrelated analysis. I think as a general matter, that level of activism is especially typical of students at elite institutions who are confident, whether they think about it this way or not, in their own ability to secure employment or to be financially comfortable after they graduate, and who, I think probably just feel more free to focus on certain kinds of issues than a lot of other students do. So I think, obviously there are broader cultural dynamics in play and what people acquire, what kinds of attitudes they acquire in the classroom and so forth. I just think that there's a sense in which some cultural commentators wring their hands at what they perceive to be toxic campus cultures. And I'm just not convinced that, to the extent that those cultures are toxic rather than expressions of insight and liberation, and I think they certainly can be both. But the important thing to recognize is we're talking about a small fraction of colleges and universities. And it's not clear to me that higher educational programs in general, students in general, are necessarily experiencing or reacting to the world in quite the same way. So, I think different factors are responsible probably for some of the dynamics that you're thinking of. I'm just not sure how important those are over the long term for most students.
Good answer. Thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
Peter.
Thank you again, Gary, for your comments. Two things. First, we know by now that the universities were created as places of higher learning and free inquiry. Well, in light of this, how would you appreciate the situation that was created last year, a few years ago, in the biology department, and how it was handled? If you care to comment about this, and if you have some insights or have done it differently. And the second thing is connected with Dave's question regarding the way Jesus taught and Socrates taught. Question is, do you see any value in the peripatetic teaching, method of teaching?
Interesting. Let's start with that, because that's actually a way in which Jesus and Socrates are alike that I didn't think about and didn't highlight in my response to Dave's question. The peripatetic model, walking and talking and communicating with the audience in that way. I think it's a great idea. It certainly has a great deal to do, obviously, with teaching through force of personality, as Socrates and Jesus both clearly did. And at the same time, it involves, very active engagement with students and the ability to communicate with students about what's going on in the broader environment, and draw on that as a resource for one's comments and so forth. So it's a great idea. It clearly doesn't work for everything. I think it's much easier to see that as useful in some disciplinary and subdisciplinary contexts than others. But I love the idea in principle. I think for the right kind of subject and the right kind of student teacher, that strikes me as exciting and stimulating. I think the last thing I want to do as a faculty member and an administrator at La Sierra is to, try to, sort of relitigate, as it were, a set of very painful conflicts that happened a few years ago. What I would say at minimum about that is this, that we want as an institution to be open as much as possible to serious conversation about scholarly concerns, whether those are concerns in the sciences or in the social sciences or in the humanities. And so I certainly want us to have an open and welcoming and at the same time critical attitude toward the expression of ideas. I also think it's vital to recognize how important it is to be respectful of the humanity of people, whether we agree with them or disagree with them. And I certainly observed, some kind of painful things that happened over the course of that dispute. I want to say in particular, of course, that I think about people who suffered as a result of that experience, and I think especially about Gary Bradley, who is a dear member of my life, participant in my life, has been for decades, and who gave so many years to La Sierra, and who I'd really like to see welcomed and treasured in that community. But I think beyond that, Peter, if it's okay, I'd rather not kind of dive into the details of that situation.
Does anybody else have a question? I don't have any more for now.
Okay, I wondered if Peter wanted to respond at all to what Gary said.
Well, what I knew is that the problem was that these teachers were teaching about the evolution theory, and as the only viable theory. Well, the way I think, if that is the case, this is what I understood was the situation, how I would have done it differently if I would have taught there. Well, of course, the theory of evolution, it's a theory that it's widespread. And it's accepted in many circles. But there is another theory that I think we have as a Christian institution, and that is the creation. Well, in teaching this, I wouldn't give the students what the theory of evolution is saying, but I would tell them that also there is another point of view, and that is creationism. That it's a different idea, that we believe that God created everything. That's the way we have done it. Not just giving the students this idea that the theory of evolution is the only way to treat this problem.
Gary has said he would rather not comment further on this, and I think there's a lot of wisdom there. But I think I'll just venture a little further into this topic. One thing I'd like to say is that I agree with the idea that students on Adventist campuses should be presented with more than one point of view on issues of origin. Now, there was some question at the time as to which department should provide that other alternative. And that's an interesting matter. But I agree with you, Peter, that somewhere along the line, students should be exposed to more than one view of origins. I think, in addition to that, students should be oriented to the history of Adventist thought on this matter, so that they see the ways in which Adventist thought has been quite continuous over time, and that also they see the way in which Adventist thought has changed about this issue of origins in one way or the other, never even coming close to abandoning the idea that the world is God's creation, but how that has been understood has varied to some degree. And I think understanding the history of that, as well as what presently is being taught, is a valuable thing. Yeah, I think that's all I'd like to say about that at this time. Do you want to say anything more, Peter?
No, I think that's, yes, I agree with you. And I gave just a general answer the way I would have done it. But of course, there is more to explain about this. Just giving a short answer that this is God's world, his creation.
You know, I've often thought about how Roman Catholic teachers are expected to handle this matter, or I should say similar matters, and they're expected to present the church's position as sympathetically as possible. Having done that, they are then free to propose ways in which the church's understanding of some matter might be improved, and point out the strengths and weaknesses of that newer alternative. But the teachers expected to present what the church teaches without sneering, without disrespect, without a sense of superiority over what the church teaches, and on and on and on. And I see you nodding your head, and so you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to do it, but people do need to be exposed to more than one point of view. And I think they should be exposed to the history of evolutionary thought too, because they then learn that evolutionary thought has not been consistent, or constant, I shouldn't say consistent, constant over the years. So the history of both of these approaches and other approaches strikes me as very, very important. Okay, thank you, Peter.
Can I just comment on that briefly, Dave?
Sure.
I think it kind of gets back to what I was talking with Gary a little bit earlier about the relationship in good learning is about the ability to agree and disagree about facts and how things change. And it has a lot to do with that. Are we talking about indoctrination, or are we talking about helping people to grow and to learn and to critically think? The only way you can learn, particularly on controversial topics, is to be exposed to both sides, or to multiple sides, as you say. And that's an attitudinal issue and relationship issue as much as it is a factual issue. So, and I guess the question is, are we saying that Adventist education in the Adventist institutions are in the same situation as the Catholic institution, in which the teachers have to present the doctrinal line of the time, but are they free to also present the alternatives and do it in a way without getting in trouble? I guess that's a matter of good administration. I'd like to hear how Gary deals with, because there's always, in every era, there will be controversial issues that need to be discussed. And if you're an institution that has a particular history, religious history, how do you do that in a really open, critical way without endangering the future generations in terms and so on? And you know what I'm talking about there, Gary.
Okay, Gary, do you want to respond to Bob? The question has been posed by him in a more general way than specifically about La Sierra University, and that I think gives you a chance to dive into this if you want to.
Sure. So we've got a whole chapter concerned with academic freedom coming up. So I'll we can come back to that when we address that chapter. But what I would say in general is that I think open inquiry is one of the biggest services that higher educational institutions render to the church. It's really important to distinguish between thinking about the church as threatened somehow by new ideas because they might lead in some way to change in the church, versus recognizing that if the church is committed to truth, and it recognizes again that all truth is God's truth, then coming to learn more enriches the church. And so I think I'd like to see a church environment in which that kind of dialogue is welcomed, and in which the kind of dialogue that is that expands the church's understanding, and in which there really therefore is room for for vigorous disagreement. And so I think that means, and I talk about this again, I think a bit more in chapter 6 of the book, but what I'd like to see, therefore, first and foremost, is not only a greater openness, I think, on the part of institutional leaders and church leaders who might get involved in higher educational issues, not only a greater openness on their part to dialogue and to openly creative and reflective thinking, but also, and I think this is, maybe I'll just try to plant this seed and we can come back to this when we talk about it later in the book. I think it's something we as faculty members have to remember, because I think that it becomes very easy to think that because we're the experts and we're the intellectually serious folks who are engaged with certain ideas, therefore we can afford to be self-confident and indeed sometimes I think even dismissive of people who take views that differ from ours on some of these highly controversial matters. I think it's important to take the beams out of our own eyes before we worry about the motes in those of others, and make sure that we ourselves support a campus climate that's genuinely open to disagreement about these matters.
That's helpful. Thank you, Gary. Bronwyn, do you have anyone else in line?
Yes, Eduardo.
Eduardo, over to you.
David, I think I remember when I read Loma Linda Messages, Willie White addresses the issue of evolution in our schools. And I think he said something like this. He said, the world teaches geology as a fact. We need to teach geology as a false theory. I think he addressed that issue in the book. And you remember our good friend Lee the third. Many students organize and collect signatures because he was teaching evolution as a fact. And eventually they didn't, they let him go, not actually let him go, but they didn't sign the new contract. That's the way they did it, to let him go. We should not be afraid of science. We need to look everywhere and analyze everything. But I don't think that the church has the liberty to teach evolution as a fact. That's my comment, David.
Okay, thank you. Are you referring to Ellen White's the collection of Ellen White's writings entitled Messages to Loma Linda?
Yes,
I see. Okay.
but I don't think that the section is written by Sister White. It was written, well, actually, it was like a kind of meeting, and then Willie White mentioned that.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I would hope that nobody would be too dogmatic about this theory or that theory. And I think there are dogmatic people in the various schools of evolution, and there are dogmatic people in the various schools of creation, and they overlap in many different and complicated ways. But when one says, I'm teaching this as a fact, that leaves little room for people to have a dissenting opinion. Now, can we allow people to have more than one point of view of how distant it is to the moon from here? Probably not. So, there are some things about which we can be more dogmatic than others. But in general, I think that dogmatism is a problem no matter where it occurs. Gary, do you want to talk about this?
Well, just briefly, I can't imagine what a disagreement about the distance from here to the moon would look like. But if somebody offered a plausible case, I'd certainly be glad to hear it. I certainly think we should be willing to be surprised. I think the only thing I want to say right now with respect to Eduardo's comment is that one way in which these matters become more difficult for us is if we think of the institution as the church teaching. And I don't think that's the right way to think about it. That is, the institution is a contributor to the church's understanding, and it contributes precisely by being a kind of ecosystem in which a range of voices participate. And no one of those voices is, quote, the voice of the church.
Which is different from a Catholic institution.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
A Catholic institution is more appropriately described as the church teaching.
Depending, of course, on what we mean by a Catholic institution. There's a difference between an institution like the Catholic University of America that is effectively operated by the Catholic hierarchy in North America as over against an institution like, say, St. Norbert's University that's operated specifically by the Norbertine order, or an institution like Notre Dame that's operated by a self-renewing board of trustees. All of those institutions have different institutional relationships to the Catholic Church, and probably how we ought to think about them in relation to, quote, the voice of the church ought to be nuanced.
And Georgetown is another example, I think, of something different from the Catholic University of America. So all of this is more complicated than it might first appear. Okay, Bronwyn, who's next?
Michael Schofield?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've been dabbling in doing research into early California Adventism. And I think we need to remember that when the formal church, Adventist church, was organized and expanded in the 1860s, 1880s, they first of all, they had a short planning horizon. So they didn't imagine having a university with a free exchange of ideas. And second, they saw their educational system, which started out as elementary and eventually went to secondary. And even the colleges were originally secondary schools. They didn't see that as a platform for free inquiry. They saw it as indoctrination, keeping the children in the faith. And then when you sent your kid off to an Adventist college, the purpose may not be that way today in La Sierra, but years ago, the purpose was to keep them in the faith and ensure that they meet a spouse who is also in the faith. And so that view because it was their theology was it was catastrophic if a child left the faith. That correct belief was important for salvation, and hence being doctrinaire or dogmatic rather was a natural function of the education. The church has diversified significantly, and there still is a good chunk of the Adventist constituency that see indoctrination as the proper role of Adventist education at any level. And part of the problem of the noun youth and the terms education is they don't distinguish between the elementary education of immature minds and graduate education of very what ought to be much more mature and secure in their beliefs minds. So that baggage of the original indoctrination persists today, and there's no getting away from it. So many members see the role of higher education in the Adventist Church as indoctrination.
Sure, I think that's exactly right. And it's an ongoing problem we have to wrestle with if we want higher education to play the role I think it can play in benefiting the church.
I wonder if what needs to happen is indeed happening, and that is different academic institutions position themselves differently on this matter. So parents can go send their children to one institution expecting it to be more dogmatic, more traditional, more interested in indoctrination. And then they might, on the other hand, go to a different Adventist institution that has positioned itself differently on these matters. And that, as a matter of fact, the pluralism in the denomination as a whole is reflected in the pluralism of its academic institutions.
Yes, and yet there are administrators at the GC level who are in denial about that pluralism.
That is a complication, Mike. Okay, Gary, any more on that?
No, I think Mike's a wise man.
Okay. Now Dr. Zimmerman has a comment, and I wonder if she would like to express it orally, verbally, or if not, I can read it. You've come on board, Laura. How about talking?
Oh, you can read it.
Okay.
Do you mind reading it?
No, but then let me see.
Well, I'm not sure. Can I look at it and okay, I'll try. I'll try to read it. I'll read it. Okay,
Yeah,
I can go back and look. So
Good.
I just was wondering. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling back. I have a question. I was wondering if Dr. Chartier has seen much in the way of an openness in looking at the educational system as a whole. This kind of relates to what was being said in kind of a way, rather than just looking at colleges and universities. Because I have spoken to members of some GC committee that exists. I don't know what it's called. Sorry, someone's walking into the room. Shh. And they don't seem to think of there being a link between the lower education and the upper education. Whereas I think that if you see children leave the lower educational levels, you're probably unlikely to see them come back. And I'm wondering if this is being studied. And then also I just made the comment that the change in demographics in colleges seems to be true from what I've seen, that much more you're seeing kids choose outside universities. But this is going to lead to a real difference in the makeup of the church in the next few years if these kids stay in the church. Anyway, so I was asking a question really about whether there was any studying going on between the lower levels in education and colleges and universities. This may not be a fair question because it may not be something that Dr. Chartier has looked at.
Well, that's the way you posed the question. Did I know? And the answer is I don't. I think you're entirely right to ask the question. And I think we talked last time about the way in which we might learn something from the Mormons. I'm not enthusiastic about a model in which we just support students at non-Adventist higher educational institutions, but certainly we ought to be able to do that. Similarly, I think the Mormon model is interesting, right? They have a huge group of people going to BYU. I don't think I'm not aware that there are Mormon elementary schools, or high schools. And so, clearly they've figured out a way to replicate the denomination in an interesting way. It's clearly doable, but are Adventists trying to learn from that? If people aren't connecting with Adventist elementary and secondary institutions, are they likely to stay connected with higher educational institutions? And right now, I think you're exactly right that the answer is probably not. I just don't know that anybody's pursuing the problem. I'm not part of conversations in which that's being discussed.
But you are well acquainted with Professor Keto on your campus. And what is she up to?
Well, so, Alyssa Keto, is a wonderful, valued colleague who's been very interested in the way in which Adventist education has affected students' cognitive development. That's been a big part of what she's been interested in. So she's intended to sort of parallel the kind of work that Bailey Gillespie and his colleagues did with respect to the Value Genesis Project. How do people's religious and moral and spiritual attitudes and practices reflect immersion in Adventist education at multiple levels? And so Alyssa's trying to ask the same question about the cognitive development of students. Certainly that's something interesting and important that, would, I hope, inform the decisions that students and parents make. I haven't been in touch lately with Alyssa to know what the current state of her work is, but certainly she's certainly posed, it seems to me, an important set of questions about, whether Adventist education shapes people's cognitive development.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Gary. We're just about ready to close. Brahman, does anyone else want to speak?
I don't have anybody on my list.
Okay, I'd like to go to a quotation that Gary put up, and then maybe the first one in my list, and then we'll call it a day. On chat, Gary put up this quotation from Alfred North Whitehead on education. Do you want to read that, Gary?
Sure. I just, when you mentioned that you were going to highlight some Whitehead quotes about education, I remembered this one and looked it up because it's one that I found startling and, provocative for many, many years. Whitehead was actually a very gifted epigrammatic writer, and people who just think about him as a difficult philosopher miss this, I think. So this quote, just caught my imagination and I think deserves more discussion. Whitehead said, "Morality, in the petty negative sense of the term, is the deadly enemy of religion. The vitality of religion is shown by the way in which the religious spirit has survived the ordeal of religious education."
Now, I wish you felt that way about only petty morality, but even more generally, I think he had reservations about people who specialize, not about the persons, but specializing in the field of ethics. Of course, he said beauty is more important than morality, and that is another thing. So just one from me, and that is the one that I mentioned earlier. Well, no, I'll go to the second one. At school, the boy painfully rises from the particular towards glimpses at general ideas. At the university, he should start from general ideas and study their applications to concrete cases. That goes along with his concern expressed elsewhere. I just think this one is fun. Knowledge does not keep any better than fish. You may be dealing with knowledge of the old species with some old truths, but somehow or another it must come to the students, as it were, just drawn out of the sea with the freshness of its immediate importance. Okay, let's stop there. I'm tempted to keep going on and on and on, but we have another opportunity. Gary, comment please on your quotation and then on the one that I mentioned about reasoning from the particular to the general and then reasoning from the general to the particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and of course, the quote that I supplied really does include two different pieces. This bit about morality in the petty sense is the enemy of religion, and it seems to me, you you of course wrote a dissertation about the bioethical availability of Whitehead's ideas, and you paid, I'm sure, much more attention than I have to the ins and outs of things Whitehead had to say about, about ethics. It does seem to me that, even as as somebody whose work, specializes in ethics in a lot of ways, I certainly understand the way in which moralism can be constraining and confining, and indeed can be, as Whitehead says somewhere else, kind of the great rallying cry for stupidity in opposition to change, right? That you can invoke moral language in ways that are confining and that are really inimical to human flourishing. I mean, there can be pretty easily, I think, if you will, a kind of ethical critique of ethics. So I think that's something we ought to be attentive to, not because we ought to be unconcerned about leading good lives, but because we ought to be aware of the degree to which kind of rigid and fossilized assumptions about good lives can get in the way of flourishing. As regards the second half of of the quote that I offered, the vitality of the religious spirit, the vitality of religion is evident in the degree to which the religious spirit can survive the ordeal of religious education. I think it's very clear, again, that institutions major in self-preservation, and institutions that major in self-preservation could very much try to pass on ideas and practices undigested, unchanged, unresponsive to reality, and leave students feeling more suppressed and oppressed than impressed by religion. And I just think that those of us who are involved in sharing religious attitudes and beliefs and practices, sharing worship, sharing theology, sharing ethics, sharing spirituality, sharing mission with students, need to be aware that we've got to exhibit a kind of openness and responsiveness that doesn't serve to hamstring the student's development, but rather fosters it. So that's, I think, what I'd want to say about that. The bit about moving from the particular to the universal, and then, as it were, back to the particular, is a really interesting description of a kind of arc on the part of the mind. I'm not sure quite what to say about it. That is, I think. It certainly is the case that as students begin to develop, they need to be increasingly aware of big picture issues and ideas. They can't probably start there, but that's where they ought to try to end up. And that once they do have that level of mastery, or at least mastery may be too strong a word, but once they do have some general understanding of big picture issues, then they can try to make sense of particulars in a way they couldn't have before. So, I mean, as it were, you might think of moving from, moving inductively, from the particular to the general, and then deductively, but that's not quite right either, because what you're really talking about is finding the context of the particular in the general of the universal, and in turn discovering the general of the universal in light of initial particular experiences. It's interesting and provocative. I'm not sure that I have anything, to add to it that's very insightful.
Well, I do think this statement is in a little tension with things he says elsewhere, and that is, he's quite clear he does not want a deductive method as such or an inductive method as such, but an interactive method such that there's movement back and forth between the particular and the general and the general and the particular. He compares it to the flight of an airplane. that lands in the mud, but then soars in the heavens and then lands in the mud again. So I think that interactive approach is interesting, and I find it valuable. But let's end on Gary's distinction between being oppressed and suppressed on the one hand in the university education and being impressed by another. That's fine. Okay, I will turn off Facebook and I will turn off the YouTube recording after the benediction. And if you want to stay by and chat further, you're more than welcome to. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. Amen.